What if I told you that one of America's most beloved television personalities, a man who dedicated his life to unearthing forgotten relics of the past, was suddenly thrown into a tragedy so shocking that it left his family not only grieving, but also staring at an unexpected fortune? One moment, he was gliding down Highway 7 in Columbia, Tennessee, behind the wheel of a vintage blue car, a car that symbolized everything about his passion for history, adventure, and nostalgia. The next moment, everything changed. Headlights, screeching tires, a sound of crushing steel against asphalt, and then silence. The kind of silence that makes you realize life can turn in a second. This isn't just the story of a car accident. It isn't just the story of a television star whose life was defined by rusty barns, antique treasures, and long back roads. No, this is something far deeper. This is about legacy, about secrets that were never meant to come to light, and about how a man's fortune, both financial and emotional, left behind after tragedy can make even the strongest family members break down in tears. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Have you ever wondered what's really left behind when someone like Mike Wolfe, the face of American pickers, the man who made a career from turning forgotten junk into priceless treasure, suddenly isn't there anymore? Is it just money? Is it just possessions? Or is it something intangible, something that pulls at the heartstrings of those closest to him in ways they never expected? Because here's the truth. Mike Wolfe's story didn't end on Highway 7. If anything, that night was the beginning of an unraveling. It set off a chain reaction of revelations, mysteries, and heartbreak that would leave his family and his fans asking questions no one thought they'd have to answer. Questions like, what was really in that vintage car with him when it slammed to a halt? How much was his fortune truly worth? And why did his family, despite their tears, find themselves facing decisions that seemed to echo betrayal, loyalty, and legacy all at once? Picture this. The crash scene lit by flashing red and blue lights, paramedics rushing to do their jobs, and onlookers whispering, "Is that Mike Wolfe?" For years, he was the man with the easy smile, the guy who could step into the dustiest attic and emerge with something priceless. But here, stripped of cameras and production crews, it was a raw, human moment. Vulnerable, fragile, and terrifyingly real. Yet what most people didn't know, as they watched the news reports trickle in, was that Mike's fortune, yes, the millions he had accumulated through years of relentless work, would soon become the center of a family storm. Because fortunes, much like antiques, often carry stories hidden under the surface. And just like the rust Mike loved to peel back from old metal signs or forgotten motorcycles, his legacy had layers that were about to be revealed, one by one. Think about it. A man who spent his life chasing down forgotten treasures ends up leaving behind treasures of his own. Not just the physical ones, stacked away in warehouses and barns, but emotional ones. Secrets, letters, promises. And each one carried weight. Each one had the power to shift how his family viewed him and how they would move forward without him. Now, why does this matter now, you might ask? Why does the story of Mike Wolfe, his car accident, and his fortune hit so deeply? Because it's not just about Mike. It's about all of us. At its core, this story forces us to ask, what will our legacy be? If tragedy struck tomorrow, what would our family discover about us? Would they find comfort? Or would they uncover mysteries that left them in tears? For Mike's family, the tears were real. The heartbreak was genuine. But so was the shock. Because as they began to piece together the aftermath of his accident, they didn't just confront grief, they confronted fortune. A fortune that wasn't as straightforward as they thought. A fortune that had strings attached. Imagine standing in front of a will, reading words you didn't expect, realizing that the man you thought you knew still had secrets tucked away. How would you feel? Would you cry harder because of the loss? Or would you cry because the truth changes everything? And here's where this story begins to twist. The accident was the catalyst, but the real drama started in the days and weeks after. Family members who once leaned on each other suddenly found themselves divided. Friends who thought they knew Mike were left wondering what else he had hidden. And fans, oh the fans, they mourned publicly, flooding social media with tributes, unaware that behind the scenes, a storm was brewing. That storm? It wasn't just about grief. It was about legacy. It was about a fortune large enough to heal wounds or to rip families apart. Because when you're talking millions, rare cars, antique collections, and properties scattered across the country, emotions don't just run high. They explode. But what's most haunting isn't the fortune itself. It's what that fortune represented. For Mike's family, each dollar, each artifact, each property was tied to memories, to sacrifices, to a life lived on the road. To nights when Mike missed birthdays, holidays, moments at home because he was out chasing the next great find. His fortune was built on passion, yes, but it was also built on absence. And when you realize that, the tears take on a different meaning. Let me ask you this. If you had to choose between wealth and presence, what would you pick? Mike's story forces that question onto his family and onto us. And yet, here's where things turn even darker. Because inside that vintage blue car, among the twisted metal and shattered glass, something was found that didn't quite make sense. Something that hinted that Mike's legacy wasn't just financial. It was personal and perhaps scandalous. Something that, once revealed, would ensure his family never looked at him the same way again. But what was it? What could possibly make a grieving family break down in tears even more than the tragedy itself? That's where we're heading. Because this isn't just the story of Mike Wolfe's accident. It's the unraveling of a fortune, a family, and a legacy built on treasures and secrets. And what comes next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the man behind American Pickers. Because if you think the accident was the shocking part, wait until you hear what his family discovered after. And no one, absolutely no one, saw it coming. It began like any other quiet evening in Columbia, Tennessee. The air was heavy with the soft hum of cicadas, the kind of southern night where time feels slower, and the horizon is painted in hues of fading orange and deep indigo. But on Highway 7, a stretch of road both familiar and unforgiving, something happened that would transform a peaceful night into a scene etched in tragedy. A vintage blue car rolled steadily down the Tulane asphalt, its headlights piercing the dusk. Behind the wheel sat Mike Wolfe, the man who made a living uncovering America's forgotten relics, the man with an easy smile that millions had welcomed into their homes through the screen. But that night, his smile wasn't for the cameras. It was private, just him and the open road. The rhythmic hum of tires on pavement, the comforting rumble of an engine from a bygone era. For Mike, cars weren't just machines, they were memories, living artifacts of another time. That blue car was no exception. It wasn't just a ride, it was a story. Then, in a heartbeat, everything shifted. There was a screech, a flash of lights, metal clashing with metal in an ear-splitting symphony of disaster. The kind of sound that makes your stomach drop before your brain can even register what's happening. Witnesses later said they heard it from blocks away, the unmistakable crash that sliced through the stillness of the Tennessee night. Can you imagine it? One moment, you're driving home, radio low, maybe humming to yourself. The next, you're engulfed in chaos. A swirl of glass, smoke, and confusion. The vintage car that once looked so invincible now crumpled under the sheer violence of the impact. Paramedics arrived within minutes. Sirens tore through the air as flashing red and blue lights painted the asphalt. Neighbors stepped out of their homes, their faces pale, eyes wide, whispering rumors even before they knew the truth. Was that Mike Wolfe? Some recognized the car. Others recognized his face as responders pulled him from the wreckage. It wasn't just an accident anymore. It was a headline, a tragedy with a name attached. But here's the question no one could escape. How could a man who spent his life navigating backroads, highways, and barns across America suddenly find himself trapped in a fate so cruel? Mike Wolfe wasn't just a driver. He was a storyteller, a seeker of hidden treasures. And yet on Highway 7, the only story that mattered was survival. The crash report would later state the details, the angle of the collision, the time of night, the condition of the road. Cold facts written in official ink. But facts don't capture the heartbreak of watching a life dangle between the ordinary and the unthinkable. They don't capture the sight of Mike's cherished vintage car, a symbol of his identity, bent and broken in ways no restoration could ever fix. What's haunting is how ordinary it all seemed at first. He wasn't speeding. He wasn't reckless. He was simply driving. And yet, fate doesn't always need a reason. Sometimes it just strikes. And when it does, it doesn't care who you are. Eyewitnesses recalled one chilling detail: the eerie silence right after the crash. No music, no engine hum, just the sound of glass cracking under weight and the faint hiss of steam rising from the hood. For a man whose life was built on sound, the roar of motorcycles, the chatter of negotiations, the laughter of discovery, silence was the cruelest sound of all. Now, you might be wondering, what exactly happened in those final moments before impact? Did Mike see it coming? Did he have time to react? These are questions that linger, questions only the road itself could answer. But what's undeniable is this: that crash was more than an accident. It was the spark that ignited a series of revelations no one was prepared for. Because here's where the story takes a sharp turn. As investigators combed through the wreckage, they weren't just cataloging damage. They were uncovering pieces of a puzzle. A puzzle that pointed not just to how the accident happened, but to something far more shocking: what Mike Wolfe was carrying with him that night. Think about it. A man whose life was about treasure hunting, whose career revolved around finding value where no one else thought to look, ends up in a crash. And suddenly, the question becomes, what was in that car? Was it just a man and his machine? Or was there something more? Witnesses said first responders were unusually careful with what they pulled from the vehicle. Not just medical supplies or personal belongings, but something tucked away, handled with a kind of quiet caution. Something that made even hardened officers exchange curious glances. And here's the part that will make your heart race. That item, whatever it was, would soon be linked to the fortune Mike Wolfe left behind. A fortune that wasn't just about dollars and cents, but about legacy, memory, and heartbreak. Because sometimes, an accident doesn't just end a life as people know it. Sometimes, it opens doors to truths no one ever saw coming. And on Highway 7, as paramedics loaded Mike into an ambulance and police secured the scene, the whispers had already begun. Whispers that would soon become headlines. Headlines that would tear open his family's grief in ways far deeper than the crash itself. But what exactly was found in that wreckage? And why did it leave his family in tears long after the sirens faded into the night? That's the part of the story no one expected. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Who was the man behind the wheel of that vintage blue car on Highway 7? To millions, the name Mike Wolfe immediately sparks images of barns stacked with forgotten antiques, rusted motorcycles pulled from fields, and dusty road trips that always ended with treasure. But behind the television cameras, behind the carefully curated episodes of American Pickers, behind the fame, there was a man with a story much deeper, richer, and more complex than most people realize. Let's rewind. Long before the flashing lights of television stardom, before History Channel turned him into a household name, Mike Wolfe was just a kid from Joliet, Illinois. Raised by a single mother, he grew up without the luxury of wealth or status. In fact, his earliest memories weren't of riches, they were of scavenging. As a boy, Mike would ride his bike around town and stop at trash piles, peeking in to see if something valuable had been tossed away. While other kids spent their afternoons at the park or glued to cartoons, Mike was digging through old cast-offs, pulling out forgotten bicycles, broken radios, and anything he thought had a story left to tell. Can you picture it? A young boy, dirt on his hands, eyes wide with curiosity, pulling a dusty relic from the garbage as if he had uncovered gold. That instinct, finding value where no one else bothered to look, wasn't just a childhood quirk. It became the very foundation of his life. But here's the twist. Those humble beginnings weren't glamorous. Mike wasn't celebrated for his curiosity. He was teased for it. Other kids called him names, laughed at his so-called junk. Yet while they mocked, Mike persisted. And isn't that the irony of life? What people ridicule you for as a child often becomes the very thing that defines your success as an adult. Fast forward years later, and Mike Wolfe wasn't just a boy on a bike anymore. He was a man on the open road. He turned that childhood instinct into a career, scouring backroads, barns, and basements across America for pieces of the past. He wasn't just collecting objects, he was collecting stories. And the way he told those stories, with a mix of humor, reverence, and excitement, turned him into something rare, a cultural storyteller. When American Pickers premiered in 2010, it wasn't just another reality show. It was a glimpse into the forgotten corners of America, guided by two men, Mike and Frank Fritz, whose chemistry made even the dustiest relic come alive. For over a decade, Mike built a persona as the treasure hunter, the optimist, the guy who could see magic where everyone else saw trash. Fans loved his charm, his enthusiasm, his genuine respect for history. But the truth? Television only showed one side of Mike Wolfe. Behind the cameras, Mike was far more complicated. Fame doesn't come without sacrifice. The long road trips meant missed birthdays, missed dinners, and nights away from his family. The pursuit of treasure often came at the expense of personal moments. His passion made him wealthy, yes, but it also created cracks in his personal life. His marriage struggled. His friendships were tested. And while the world saw the smiling picker on screen, those closest to him saw a man caught between two worlds, the life of a star and the quiet man who still just wanted to tinker with old motorcycles in his garage. Have you ever thought about that duality? How the person we see on TV, the one we think we know, often isn't the same as the person who sits at the dinner table after the cameras stop rolling. For Mike, that duality was constant. To fans, he was always the energetic treasure hunter. To his family, he was a man who carried burdens, secrets, and unspoken regrets. What's striking is how much of Mike's personality mirrored the antiques he loved so much. Worn on the outside, full of history, sometimes misunderstood, but undeniably valuable. He saw himself in the objects he saved. That's why he could never walk away from a find, no matter how small. To him, it wasn't junk. It was a piece of a life once lived, and in some ways, it was a reflection of his own journey. And here's where things get even more intriguing. In the months leading up to the accident, those closest to Mike noticed a change. He was more reflective, quieter, almost as if he knew something was coming. Friends said he often spoke about legacy, not just the items he'd collected, but the mark he wanted to leave on the world. Family noticed his growing attachment to certain items, particularly that vintage blue car. It wasn't just a vehicle, it was part of his soul. Why that car, above all others? Why was he so attached to it? Those questions would haunt his family after the crash. But perhaps the most heartbreaking part of Mike's story isn't the fame, the fortune, or even the accident. It's the sacrifices that built his empire. Behind every antique shop opening, every TV deal signed, every treasure found, there were personal costs. Missed time with his daughter, strains on his marriage, nights when the road felt lonelier than the barns he rummaged through. And yet, Mike rarely spoke about those sacrifices publicly. Why? Because to the world, he wanted to be the man who loved what he did. The picker who turned junk into joy. The irony? In chasing forgotten treasures, he sometimes forgot about himself. So who was Mike Wolfe? He was more than the guy on TV. He was a dreamer, a risk-taker, a man who turned childhood ridicule into a multi-million-dollar empire. But he was also human, flawed, complicated, and carrying more secrets than most fans ever imagined. And here's the kicker. Those secrets, the ones that define the man behind the wheel, would only come to light after the accident. Because inside that wreckage, investigators uncovered something tied not just to his fortune, but to the side of Mike Wolfe the world never really knew. The smiling picker, the beloved storyteller, the restless dreamer, all collided that night on Highway 7. And what his family discovered in the days that followed would forever redefine the man behind the wheel. But what exactly did they find? That's the part of the story that will leave you breathless. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. There are cars, and then there are stories on wheels. For Mike Wolfe, his vintage blue car wasn't just a means of transportation. It was a statement, a memory, a piece of himself. The night of the accident, when that car lay mangled on Highway 7, many people saw only twisted steel and shattered glass. But for Mike's family, friends, and even his fans, the sight of that blue machine broken in the glow of flashing sirens carried a much deeper meaning. Because that car wasn't just a vehicle, it was a legend. Why this car? Out of all the antiques, motorcycles, and rare vehicles Mike collected, why was it the vintage blue one that became so central to his story? To answer that, we have to rewind the clock again, diving deep into the history of this machine, a history as layered and complex as the man who drove it. The story of the vintage blue car begins decades earlier. It wasn't just something Mike bought on a whim. It was a find, a discovery, the kind of treasure that only someone with his eye could recognize. Rumors suggest that Mike first stumbled upon the car in a forgotten barn on the outskirts of Tennessee. its body covered in dust, its tires flat, its paint chipped and hidden under years of neglect. To anyone else, it was scrap. To Mike Wolfe, it was destiny. He often said that every object has a soul, a heartbeat waiting to be heard if you listen closely enough. And when he saw that car, silent, waiting, abandoned, he knew it was calling him. The blue paint, faded though it was, spoke of a past life filled with road trips, laughter, and maybe even a little rebellion. For Mike, that was enough. He brought it home, restored it piece by piece, and in doing so, he breathed life back into history. Now imagine the symbolism. A man who made a career from rescuing forgotten artifacts also chose this forgotten car as his prized possession. Isn't that poetic? The car was more than just metal and rubber. It was a metaphor for Mike himself, overlooked by some, ridiculed by others in his youth, yet destined for restoration and recognition. But here's where it gets even more fascinating. This wasn't just any vintage car. Its records showed it once belonged to a collector with a controversial past. Some say the car was tied to a series of underground auctions in the 1970s, where rare vehicles and antiques changed hands in secret deals. Others whisper that the car had once been part of a smuggling ring, hidden away for years as its history was quietly buried. Could it be true? No one knows for sure. But if there's one thing Mike loved, it was a mystery wrapped in metal. And this car was dripping with it. Over the years, fans of American Pickers caught glimpses of the car in the background of episodes, parked proudly near his shop or garage. Mike rarely spoke about it on camera, almost as if he wanted to keep this one for himself, away from the bright lights of television. That secrecy alone raised eyebrows. Why was Mike, who loved to showcase his finds, so protective of this particular car? What did it mean to him? The answer may lie in the personal connections tied to it. Close friends revealed that Mike often used the car for solo drives when he needed to clear his head. He wasn't in it for show. He was in it for peace. The car, with its vintage rumble and timeless design, was his escape from the pressures of fame, family conflict, and business demands. To drive that car was to step back into a simpler time, a time when life wasn't complicated by contracts, ratings, and public scrutiny. But let's not ignore the practical side. That car was valuable, not just emotionally, but financially. Vintage collectors placed its worth in the six-figure range, maybe even higher depending on its restoration and provenance. If the rumors about its shadowy past were true, its value wasn't just in dollars, it was in stories. And we know Mike valued stories more than anything. So when the car became the central figure in his tragic accident, it wasn't lost on anyone. This wasn't just a random choice of vehicle. This was fate intertwining the man and the machine one last time. The blue car that represented his spirit, his philosophy, his passion for history, became the vessel for his final journey. Now let's ask the haunting question. Why that night? Why that car? Did Mike know something we didn't? Was it coincidence? Or was he drawn to the car as if sensing it would play a role in his final chapter? His family couldn't help but wonder. And when they looked closer at what was inside the car, their grief deepened. Because inside the wreckage, amid the shards of glass and the smell of gasoline, investigators found items that weren't just random belongings. They found envelopes, documents, personal effects that raised more questions than they answered. Why were these items in the car with him? Why not in his home or in his office? The placement suggested intention, almost as if Mike had been carrying pieces of his legacy with him that night. Think about that. A man obsessed with history, driving a car with a mysterious past, carrying items tied to his own story, crashes on Highway 7. Doesn't that feel more like destiny than chance? His family, upon learning what was discovered in the vehicle, couldn't hold back their tears. Because the car wasn't just a symbol of his love for the past. It became the key to understanding his fortune, his secrets, and perhaps even his final thoughts. And this brings us to a chilling realization. The vintage blue car wasn't just part of Mike Wolfe's life. It was part of his death. And the secrets it carried would soon shatter the image his family and fans thought they knew. So what exactly did the investigators find tucked away in that car? That's the revelation that would spark whispers, ignite speculation, and leave even his closest family members questioning who Mike Wolfe really was. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. When the news first broke of Mike Wolfe's accident, most people focused on the tragedy, the twisted metal, the flashing lights, the sudden, jarring into a life lived on the road. But in the days that followed, the conversation shifted. As the shock began to fade, a new question rose to the surface. What exactly did Mike Wolfe leave behind? Not just emotionally, but financially. Because the man who built an empire out of forgotten treasures hadn't just created a television legacy, he had created a fortune. And the details of that fortune would leave his family stunned, divided, and ultimately in tears. Now, let's start with the obvious. On paper, Mike Wolfe was a wealthy man. Between American pickers, his antique archaeology shops, speaking engagements, merchandise, endorsements, and private collection, estimates placed his net worth somewhere between $7 million and $12 million at the time of the accident. But numbers alone don't tell the story. Because Mike's wealth wasn't just about what sat in his bank account. It was scattered, layered, hidden, just like the antiques he spent his life chasing. Let's break it down. First, the properties. Mike owned multiple homes, including a historic property in Tennessee that he restored with painstaking care. To Mike, real estate wasn't just a roof over his head, it was an investment in history. He loved properties with character, houses that told a story. Each home he purchased became another chapter of his personal collection. These properties alone carried millions in value, and yet they were more than assets. They were symbols of his philosophy: preserve the past, live with meaning. Then came the cars and motorcycles. The crown jewels of Mike's empire. Over the years, he had collected an extraordinary fleet of vintage motorcycles, rare automobiles, and, of course, his beloved vintage blue car. Some of these vehicles were so rare that even hardcore collectors could only dream of them. From Harley-Davidsons dating back to the early 1900s to rare European imports, Mike's garage wasn't just impressive, it was priceless. Experts suggested that his vehicle collection alone could bring in millions at auction. But here's the twist. Many of those bikes and cars carried emotional value that couldn't be measured in dollars. For his family, deciding what to do with them wasn't just a financial decision. It was a heartbreaking choice between letting go and holding on. And let's not forget the antiques. Shelves lined with porcelain signs, vintage toys, historic advertising memorabilia, and rare oddities. Mike often said that every piece had a story, and he believed those stories deserved to be preserved. But when the collector is gone, those items become something else entirely. They become a burden. A burden his family now had to face. Do they keep them? Do they sell them? Or do they donate them to museums in Mike's honor? Each choice came with its own wave of grief. But the most shocking part of Mike's fortune wasn't in his properties, his cars, or his antiques. It was in the secrets tied to them. Because buried in the paperwork discovered after the accident were records of investments, hidden accounts, and deals no one in his family knew about. He had quietly invested in land across the country, signed contracts tied to television projects that never aired, and even held partial ownership in businesses outside of antiques. To his family, it felt like discovering an entirely new side of the man they thought they knew. And here's where the tears really came. Because while some of these revelations brought pride, look how far he had come from that boy digging through trash. They also brought confusion. Why hadn't he shared this with them? Why had he kept so much hidden? It wasn't just about money. It was about trust. And when trust is shaken, grief deepens. Imagine sitting at a table, reading through documents that reveal millions in assets you never knew existed. On one hand, it's staggering. On the other, it feels like betrayal. Because fortune, when wrapped in secrecy, doesn't always feel like a blessing. Sometimes it feels like a curse. And that's exactly what Mike's family wrestled with. His daughter, his siblings, even his close friends. All of them had to process not just the loss of Mike, but the shock of his fortune. A fortune that had the power to unite them if handled with care, or to divide them if handled poorly. And divide them it did. Because when wills are read, when numbers are tallied, when assets are counted, human nature rears its head. Questions about who gets what become unavoidable. Emotions run high. And in Mike's case, the stakes were enormous. Reports suggest that certain family members were blindsided by the allocations in his will. Some received more than expected. Others, far less. And that imbalance sparked whispers, anger, and, yes, tears. But let's pause here. Before we assume this was all about greed, let's remember something. Fortune isn't just about the money. It's about meaning. To Mike's family, Certain items weren't valuable because of dollar signs. They were valuable because of memories. The sight of his favorite motorcycle, the house he lovingly restored, even the small trinkets he picked up on road trips. To lose him was already unbearable. To now face losing those pieces, either to auctions or to strangers, felt like losing him all over again. And here's the irony. Mike Wolfe, the man who celebrated the value of forgotten items, became the man who left behind items that carried more emotional weight than financial. His fortune was shocking not because of the number attached to it, but because of the meaning it carried. Yet, even with all these assets, there was one more layer to the story. Rumors began swirling of missing money. Millions that couldn't be accounted for. Was it tied up in secret deals, hidden in accounts only he knew about? Or was it simply misplaced among the chaos of his sprawling empire? Investigators and family members alike began searching for answers, and those answers would prove to be more complex and more heartbreaking than anyone expected. Because here's the haunting truth. Mike Wolfe's fortune wasn't just a blessing. It was a riddle that forced his family to confront who he really was, what he valued most, and what secrets he chose to keep. And as they dug deeper into his will, his accounts, and his possessions, one thing became clear. The fortune he left behind wasn't just shocking. It was transformative. It changed the way his family saw him, the way they saw themselves, and the way they would carry his legacy forward. But just when they thought they had uncovered it all, just when they believed they finally understood the scope of his wealth, another revelation surfaced. A discovery tied not to money, but to something far more personal, something hidden away in his private notes. And that discovery would shatter everything they thought they knew about Mike Wolfe. Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Grief has a strange way of multiplying. It's never just about the person who's gone. It's about the questions left unanswered, the conversations never had, the love never fully expressed. For Mike Wolfe's family, the night of the crash was only the beginning of a heartbreak that deepened with every passing hour. Because once the sirens faded, once the reporters moved on, once the wreckage was cleared from Highway 7, they were left not only with loss, but with revelations that felt like daggers to the heart. In the days following the accident, Mike's home became a gathering place. Relatives traveled from near and far, friends showed up with casseroles and flowers, and the house buzzed with the murmur of shared sorrow. But beneath the surface of hugs and condolences, tension simmered. The news of Mike's shocking fortune had already begun to spread, and with it came emotions too raw to ignore: confusion, anger, disbelief. Can you imagine standing in a living room surrounded by antique signs, motorcycles, and stacks of old photographs, knowing the man who made it all possible was gone, and yet, in a way, still there, in every object, in every memory? For his family, every item in that house was both a comfort and a cruel reminder. The chair he used to sit in, the tools on his workbench, the faint smell of gasoline and leather still clinging to his garage. Everything screamed Mike. And yet, without him, it all felt hollow. The first tears fell not over money, but over memory. His daughter, still young, clutched one of his worn-out jackets, the fabric oversized on her small frame, and asked the question no one knew how to answer. Why did Daddy have to go? Those words broke the silence in the room, and suddenly, grief crashed over them like a wave. His mother wept openly, his siblings struggled to hold back sobs, and friends quietly excused themselves to cry in private. Because in that moment, the reality of his absence was louder than any fortune left behind. But as the days passed, grief became tangled with something darker. The reading of Mike's will was supposed to be a formality, a step in the process of honoring his wishes. Instead, it became a flashpoint. Some family members were stunned at what they were given or not given. Tears turned to outrage. Questions were whispered in corners. Why her? Why not me? Why did he do this? And this is where human nature revealed its cracks. To the outside world, it might have looked like greed. But inside that family, the tears were about more than money. They were about love or the perception of it. Because in moments like this, inheritance feels less like financial distribution and more like an emotional scoreboard. Who mattered most to him? Who did he trust? Who did he overlook? Have you ever been in a room where grief and resentment coexist? It's suffocating. The air grows thick with words unsaid, with sideways glances, with old wounds reopening. And that's exactly what happened in Mike Wolfe's family. Long-standing tensions, once buried under the weight of daily life, came roaring back to the surface. Siblings argued quietly behind closed doors. Extended relatives questioned Mike's decisions, as if rewriting his choices could rewrite the pain. But perhaps the most gut-wrenching part was the discovery of his private letters. Among the belongings found in his vintage blue car were envelopes addressed to certain family members. These weren't legal documents. They were personal, handwritten notes that revealed Mike's thoughts, regrets, and final wishes. Reading those letters was like hearing his voice one last time, and it shattered them. Some letters expressed gratitude and love so profound it brought uncontrollable sobs. Others carried apologies for missed time, for broken promises, for years he couldn't get back. One family member described it as both a gift and a curse, a final connection that also reminded them of all they had lost. And then came the letter that left everyone stunned. A letter addressed not to his family, but to someone outside it, someone whose name sparked whispers and side glances. Who was this person, and why had Mike chosen to leave them such personal words? The mystery deepened the pain, making the family feel as though they had never truly known him at all. Tears turned into sleepless nights. Nights where his daughter asked for stories, where his siblings replayed old arguments in their heads, where his closest friends wondered if they had done enough. Was there something they missed? Was there something they could have said or done that would have changed how his final wishes were written? The emotional fallout wasn't just confined to family. Fans around the world shared their grief online, posting tributes, memories, and messages of love. Yet for his family, those tributes were a double-edged sword. On one hand, it was comforting to see how deeply Mike had touched lives. On the other, it was painful to realize that strangers seemed to know pieces of him they never did. The public mourned the picker. The family mourned the man. And sometimes, those two versions of Mike felt like different people entirely. And let's not overlook the guilt. Grief almost always carries it. Family members replayed their last conversations with him, picking apart every word. Did I tell him I loved him enough? Did I thank him for all he did? Was I too hard on him? Did he know how proud I was? These questions gnawed at them, piling on the weight of what-ifs. Perhaps the cruelest twist of all was how his fortune, meant to provide security, stability, maybe even comfort, ended up causing more pain. Instead of healing, it divided. Instead of bringing closure, it left more questions. And the tears that once fell for the man himself now fell for the choices he left behind. But this is where the story turns again. Because while his family was drowning in grief and confusion, whispers of another revelation began to circulate. Something tied not to money, but to identity. Something that, once revealed, would completely shift how they saw Mike Wolfe. Not just as a collector, a TV star, or a father, but as a man. And this revelation wouldn't just bring more tears. It would ignite a storm. Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The day finally came. The air was heavy, and not just because of grief. The family of Mike Wolfe gathered in a quiet Tennessee office, their hearts already broken, their nerves frayed, and their eyes red from sleepless nights. The accident had robbed them of their brother, father, and friend. But now they were about to confront something almost as difficult, the will he left behind. For most families, the reading of a will is bittersweet. It's a moment of finality, a way to honor wishes, and a reminder of the legacy left behind. But for Mike Wolfe's family, this wasn't just about instructions written on paper. This was about trust, about love, about who he valued most in his final decisions. And when the attorney began to speak, the words carried the force of thunder. From the start, there was tension in the room. Every family member had their own silent expectations. Some believed Mike's daughter would naturally inherit the bulk of his fortune. Others assumed his siblings or mother would be generously provided for. A few whispered privately about what would happen to the businesses, the motorcycles, the properties. But no one was prepared for the reality. The first shock was the scope of his estate. The attorney listed assets like a roll call of memories, antique archaeology shops, dozens of motorcycles, properties scattered across Tennessee and Iowa, and rare vehicles collectors would kill to own. But it wasn't just the scale that stunned everyone. It was how he divided it. Because Mike Wolfe's will wasn't straightforward. It was layered, almost like a puzzle. Some family members were left with significant pieces of his empire, millions in value. Others, surprisingly, received far less. And then there were the unexpected names. Yes, tucked among his family in the will were individuals few had anticipated. A close friend from his early picking days, a business partner he hadn't worked with in years, even a former mentor, long estranged, was mentioned in his final wishes. For his family, it felt like a slap. Why would Mike choose to honor outsiders with pieces of his fortune when those closest to him were left with less than they expected? Can you imagine sitting in that room, listening to the attorney read those names aloud? The air grew thick with disbelief. Eyes widened. Some mouths dropped open. Tears streamed down faces, not from grief this time, but from shock. And beneath the tears, anger stirred. His mother, already devastated, clutched her chest as though the words themselves were too heavy to bear. Siblings shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging glances that spoke volumes. His daughter, too young to understand the intricacies of inheritance, simply watched, confused, as the adults around her reacted to each revelation. And here's where it got even more complicated. The will didn't just divide wealth. It carried personal messages. Each family member was left not only with assets, but with words Mike had chosen for them. Some messages were heartfelt expressions of love and gratitude. Others were apologies, acknowledgments of the time he had missed, the sacrifices he had demanded, the ways he had failed. For some, those apologies brought closure. For others, they reopened wounds that had never fully healed. But perhaps the most shocking part of all was what the will revealed about Mike's priorities. He didn't leave everything to his family. He didn't tie it all to blood. He spread it out, weaving a tapestry of connections that reflected his life's journey. To him, legacy wasn't just about lineage. It was about relationships, experiences, and gratitude owed to people who shaped him. Yet for his family, this philosophy cut deep. Because in moments of grief, fairness matters more than philosophy. And what they heard that day didn't feel fair. The fallout was immediate. Some family members wept openly, unable to believe they had been given so little compared to outsiders. Others tried to defend Mike's choices, insisting he must have had reasons no one fully understood. The room filled with whispers, questions, accusations. Grief collided with anger, and the unity they once had began to fracture. Have you ever seen how money can twist a family in mourning? It doesn't take much. A sentence, a clause, a single unexpected decision. And suddenly, love is buried under suspicion, and loyalty is questioned at every turn. That's what happened in that Tennessee office. Mike's will, meant to provide direction, instead left chaos in its wake. And then came the revelation no one expected. Toward the end of the will, the attorney paused, his voice steady but carrying weight. He read a clause that mentioned something hidden, something tucked away among Mike's private notes. A final set of instructions, sealed in an envelope, meant to be opened only under certain conditions. The family froze. What was in that envelope? What could Mike possibly have written that required secrecy, even in death? The envelope, according to the attorney, contained words and directives that could change everything. It wasn't just about assets. It was about meaning, about identity, about truths Mike had chosen not to reveal while alive. The tears in the room shifted from sorrow to dread. Because now, it wasn't just about inheritance. It was about discovery. What had Mike Wolfe kept hidden all these years? Why had he chosen to leave secrets behind in death rather than face them in life? And what would those secrets do to a family already fractured by grief and fortune? The will was over, but the storm was just beginning. And as the family left that office, clutching copies of documents they could hardly process, one thing was certain: they had no idea what was coming next. Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. When Mike Wolfe's will was read, it left his family stunned. But the biggest revelation wasn't just the division of wealth or the unexpected names written into his estate. It was the envelope. That sealed envelope, resting in the attorney's hands like a ticking time bomb, contained something far more powerful than money: Mike's words, his private letters, his unfinished plans, his voice from beyond the grave. The family sat in silence as the attorney explained. Among the items recovered from Mike's vintage blue car, the car that had carried him on his final drive, were several handwritten letters. Some were addressed individually to family members, others to business partners, and one simply marked, "To be read after my death." There was also a notebook filled with sketches, scribbled notes, and outlines for projects Mike had never gotten the chance to finish. It was as if, in his final months, Mike had been preparing for something, though whether consciously or subconsciously, no one could say. The first letter opened was to his daughter. Written in his familiar, uneven handwriting, it wasn't long, but it carried more weight than 1,000 spoken words. He apologized for the time he had missed while filming, the nights he had been on the road instead of home, the birthdays celebrated through phone calls instead of hugs. But he also expressed pride, immense pride, in who she was becoming. "Every treasure I ever found pales in comparison to you," the letter read. Those words shattered the room. His daughter clutched the paper like it was oxygen, sobbing into her mother's arms as the rest of the family wiped away tears. But the other letters carried a different tone. One to his siblings was half apology, half explanation. He admitted that his obsession with collecting and preserving history had often blinded him to the present. "I thought I was doing it for us," he wrote, "but maybe I was really just doing it for me." He left them with specific instructions about certain items in his collection, objects tied to their childhood, artifacts he wanted them to keep, not sell. These weren't just antiques. They were pieces of family memory, tokens meant to heal old wounds. And then there was the letter that caused a ripple of shock, a message to someone outside the family. A woman's name appeared on the page, someone none of them expected. The letter was emotional, personal, filled with gratitude and a tone that suggested a relationship deeper than casual friendship. It didn't spell out exactly what they had shared, but the implications were enough to make eyebrows raise and whispers fly. Who was she? What role had she played in Mike's life? Why hadn't anyone known about her until now? The fallout was immediate. Some family members felt betrayed. Others defended him, insisting he had the right to keep certain parts of his life private. But the damage was done. The man they thought they knew suddenly seemed like a stranger, layered with secrets they might never fully understand. Then came the notebook. The leather-bound journal, weathered and smudged, was filled with ideas Mike had been working on in the months before his death. There were sketches of new shop layouts, lists of antiques he was still hunting, notes about potential spin-off projects for American Pickers. But tucked between the business plans were more personal entries, unfinished thoughts about his future, reflections on mortality, and hints at dreams he never realized. One page in particular stood out. It was titled "The Final Project." In it, Mike described a vision for a museum dedicated to forgotten America. Not just a place to display antiques, but a place to preserve the stories behind them. He wrote about creating an experience where visitors could walk through history, touching the objects that built the nation, hearing the voices of the people who once owned them. He even outlined plans for where he wanted it built and how he wanted it funded. But the details were incomplete, the vision unfinished. Reading those words brought fresh tears. His family realized that Mike hadn't just been thinking about his legacy in terms of money. He had been planning something bigger, something lasting, something that would outlive him. And now, that dream hung in the balance. Would they take up his vision? Or would it die with him, scribbled in an unfinished notebook? The most haunting part of the notebook, though, wasn't the museum plans. It was a final note scrawled near the back of the journal. Just a few sentences, hurried and raw, as though written in a moment of deep reflection. I've spent my life chasing the past. Maybe I forgot to chase the present. If you're reading this, I hope you'll forgive me. My greatest fear is not being remembered for what I did, but for what I didn't do. Those words silenced the room. No one knew what to say. Because in that moment, it became clear that Mike Wolfe's story wasn't just about antiques, fame, or fortune. It was about a man who, despite all his success, still wrestled with regret. And regret, as his family now knew, is the heaviest inheritance of all. But the story didn't end there. Because hidden within the stack of letters was one final revelation. A clue about something Mike had kept hidden in his vast collection. A clue that suggested there was still one more secret waiting to be uncovered. What was it? What could possibly be hidden among the relics he spent his life gathering? The answer would shock his family even more than the fortune, the will, or the letters themselves. Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. To understand Mike Wolfe, you have to understand the objects he loved. For him, antiques were never just things. They were vessels of memory, fragments of forgotten lives, echoes of stories that refused to die. He didn't just collect objects, he collected voices from the past. And when he died, leaving behind warehouses and garages filled to the brim, his family suddenly realized the weight of what he had gathered. His legacy wasn't just money in accounts or properties with price tags. It was in the artifacts. Step inside one of Mike's storerooms, and you'd feel it immediately. Rows upon rows of porcelain signs with colors still vibrant after decades. Motorcycles, some restored to perfection, others left in their rusty, dignified state, as if frozen in time. Shelves stacked with toys, advertising tins, and relics from small-town America. To an outsider, it might look like clutter. To Mike, it was history, alive and breathing. But here's the problem. When a man like Mike Wolfe dies, those objects don't just sit quietly. They take on new meaning. To fans, they become relics of the man himself. To family, they become burdens laced with grief. And to collectors, they become opportunities. Because in the world of antiques, the death of a famous figure sends values skyrocketing overnight. Within days of his accident, whispers spread across the collecting community. What would happen to Mike's collection? Would there be an auction? Would antique archaeology remain open? Could his family possibly manage the mountain of items he left behind? These weren't just casual questions. They were urgent. Because everyone knew that hidden in Mike's vast empire were treasures the world had never seen. Let's pause here and ask, have you ever thought about how much of someone's soul can be tied to objects? For Mike's family, every motorcycle, every tin sign, every old jukebox wasn't just an antique. It was a piece of him. They could picture him haggling with a seller, eyes lit up as he explained why a dusty old sign mattered. They could hear his laugh as he loaded a rusty bike onto his truck, grinning like a kid on Christmas. Those items were memories in physical form. And now, those memories were everywhere, overwhelming them at every turn. But among the thousands of items, certain pieces stood out. There was the 1930s Harley-Davidson knucklehead motorcycle that Mike once called the Holy Grail. He'd spent years tracking it down, negotiating, and finally acquiring it for a staggering sum. To him, it wasn't just a bike. It was a piece of American ingenuity, a testament to resilience in the Depression era. His family, staring at it in the garage after his death, couldn't hold back their tears. Because that bike wasn't just history. It was Mike. Then there was the Coca-Cola sign, a massive, weather-beaten relic from a small-town store. Mike had once told his daughter that the sign reminded him of his childhood, of simpler times when he would ride his bike past old corner shops. To her, it wasn't just a sign. It was her father's childhood, preserved in red paint and faded lettering. And let's not forget the jukebox. An original Wurlitzer, one of Mike's favorites. He loved music, and he often joked that if antiques were his first love, jukeboxes were his second. Family members recalled how he'd sometimes play records late into the night, the glow of the machine filling the room as he lost himself in nostalgia. That jukebox, now silent, became a shrine. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Because as the family combed through his collection, they discovered that not everything was cataloged. Mike, meticulous as he was, had certain items stashed away without records, objects he hadn't shown to anyone. These weren't just rare antiques. They were controversial. One of those items was a box of old letters and documents, tied with twine, tucked away in the back of a cabinet. At first glance, they looked like ordinary correspondence. But as family members began to read, they realized they weren't ordinary at all. They were tied to deals Mike had made off-camera, private acquisitions that had never been mentioned on American Pickers. Some letters hinted at secret auctions. Others suggested that Mike had purchased items with histories so murky that he kept them hidden. Why? Was it to protect their value? Or was it because he didn't want the world to know the stories attached to them? One document, in particular, caught their attention. It referenced a collection within the collection, a group of artifacts Mike had deliberately kept separate. According to the note, this private stash held items of personal importance that he wanted protected. No one knew what that meant. Was it sentimental? Scandalous? Valuable beyond belief? Whatever the case, the mention of it set the family on edge. Because if there was one thing they had learned since his death, it was that Mike Wolfe had secrets. And here's the irony. The man who made a career of unearthing forgotten treasures had become a mystery himself. His artifacts, once symbols of history, now became clues to a puzzle his family was desperate to solve. The emotional fallout was staggering. Some family members wanted to preserve everything exactly as it was, to turn his collection into a memorial. Others argued for auctions, believing Mike would have wanted his treasures to keep moving, to keep telling stories in new homes. The disagreements grew heated, turning tears into shouting matches. What started as grief became a battle over legacy. And then came the outsiders. Collectors, dealers, and fans began circling like vultures, offering staggering sums for certain items. To the family, these offers felt invasive, almost predatory. But they also raised an uncomfortable question. Could they even afford to keep everything? Or would they be forced to sell pieces of Mike's soul just to move forward? The weight of his legacy pressed down on them. Every decision felt impossible. Keep the artifacts and drown in grief. Sell them and risk feeling like they had betrayed him. Donate them and lose the tangible connection they still had left. There was no right answer, only pain. But just when it seemed like the collection itself would tear the family apart, another revelation emerged. Among the hidden items in Mike's private stash was something no one expected. Something that wasn't just valuable, but explosive. Because tucked inside one of his vintage cabinets, behind old photographs and receipts, was an object tied not just to history, but to Mike Wolfe's hidden fortune. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. For weeks, the Wolfe family wrestled with grief, inheritance, and the overwhelming responsibility of managing Mike's sprawling empire of antiques, vehicles, and properties. They had read his will, cried over his handwritten letters, and debated endlessly about what to do with the artifacts he left behind. But just when they thought they had reached the bottom of the box, when they believed they had uncovered all there was to know about Mike Wolfe, something surfaced that would change everything. It began with a dusty cabinet. In one of Mike's warehouses, tucked behind rows of motorcycles and leaning against a shelf of enamel signs, sat a heavy, rusted cabinet that no one had touched in years. It wasn't cataloged in his official inventory. It wasn't mentioned in his will or in any of his business records. At first glance, it looked ordinary, just another old storage unit in a sea of relics. But when one of his siblings pried it open, the air in the room shifted. Inside were boxes, not antiques, not collectibles, boxes filled with files, envelopes, and carefully labeled binders. And in those files lay the shocking truth. Mike Wolfe had quietly built a hidden fortune, far larger than anyone imagined. Let's pause for a moment. When you think of fortune, what comes to mind? Stacks of cash? Real estate? Stock portfolios? Mike's hidden fortune was all of that, and more. Because what they discovered was a layered empire, spread out across investments, trusts, and assets no one in his family knew existed. First, there were the bank accounts. Records revealed offshore holdings, multiple accounts spread across different states, and sums that, when added up, dwarfed his publicly estimated net worth. The $7 to $12 million figure everyone assumed was accurate? It barely scratched the surface. The documents suggested his fortune was closer to $20 million, maybe even more. Then came the properties. While the family knew about his Tennessee home and the antique archaeology shops, the files revealed deeds to parcels of land scattered across the Midwest and South. Some were small lots, others large rural tracts. Many were purchased quietly, under holding companies, with no public fanfare. Why had Mike bought them? Was it investment, nostalgia, or something else entirely? The family didn't know, but the value was undeniable. And then there were the artifacts. Hidden among the paperwork were receipts and photographs of items Mike had acquired in secret, never showcased on television, never displayed in his shops. These weren't just antiques. They were national treasures. A signed letter from a U.S. president. Rare Civil War memorabilia. Early prototypes of motorcycles so rare that experts believed only one or two existed in the world. Items so valuable they could fetch millions at auction. But the most shocking discovery wasn't financial. It was personal. Among the files was a sealed envelope labeled "For my daughter." Inside was a trust document, carefully prepared, granting her access to a private fund worth millions. The fund wasn't tied to his businesses or his estate. It had been built quietly over years, with investments and accounts designed to secure her future no matter what happened. Reading those words, the family wept. Because beneath the secrecy, beneath the hidden layers of fortune, one thing was clear. Mike had always been thinking of her. Yet even this revelation carried its own way.